So welcome back. In this part, we are going to talk about the final things you really need to get playing, which is a quick recap of what you need sort of physically, how to set up the pitch, how to prepare two teams for a game, and finally how the kickoff works. So we talked a bit about this in part one, but it probably fits better here really, and because we've largely covered some of this already, it can be very brief with those bits, just in mentioning what you need. So you need a pitch, templates, which are optional, as we've discussed, a set of dice, usually a set of dice for each coach, but you can get away with one set. And the set is 2d6, a d8, a d16, and 3 block dice. So we've talked about there are ways around the d16 and the block dice, but the d6s and the d8 are essential. And you also need two teams of players, which is something we've not really talked about yet. So if you have the second season box, the two teams you'll have in there are Imperial Nobility and Black Orcs. If those are the two teams you have to start, go for it, it should be fine. Like I said earlier in the series, they're not ideal teams to learn the game with. I'm going to look at them both in detail in part 8, so it might be worth looking in on that, sort of find out a bit how they work, what makes them a bit more complicated. In earlier editions of the game, the two teams that came with it were always humans or orcs, which have always been good, solid starter teams. And it might be that if you've got one of those box sets, you've just picked up the new rules, you might have miniatures for those teams. But there are, of course, sort of plenty of teams for sale. And I'll just pull this over, actually. So an official team, direct from Games Workshop, will set you back £26 at the time of recording. And there are currently 19 different ones of them available from them. You can often find the same teams a bit cheaper from independent stockists, so like somewhere like Element Games or Wayland Games, to name a couple, or maybe like a local game shop to you that's an independent stockist might have them. And weirdly, that they're usually a bit cheaper than buying direct from the source for some reason. I don't understand why, but often they are. And then there are third-party miniatures, of which there are loads. So these are usually called something like fantasy football miniatures. They won't name them as Blood Bowl players, even though that's what they're obviously intended for. And there are loads of them out there. So a simple Google search is going to bring up loads of options, loads of forums where people suggest things. The Blood Bowl community on Facebook is a good place to find suggestions for miniatures as well. But a few companies in particular to mention are Grebo Games, Punga and Willy Miniatures. And they all do some really nice stuff, and you will pretty much, with all of them though, pay a bit more than the Games Workshop teams. But what you do get is a full team, usually of sort of 15 to up to like 20 players. Like pretty much all of these official teams, most of them are just 12 models as well in the box. But they're missing players that you're going to want to fill out of your roster. So if we look at a good example is the Dark Elf team, which I typically can't find here. They're probably on page 2. But like the Dark Elf team, it has 2 blitzers in the box. You're going to want 4 Dark Elf blitzers at some point. And by the time you've sourced those other players, and then like not with Dark Elf so much, with other teams you've like got in a big guy and stuff like that, you're going to probably end up in the end like maybe paying somewhere towards like the 60 to 80 pounds that you might pay for like a Grebo team. So the costs can end up sort of evening out a bit. And it's worth looking at for Kickstarters as well. So Grebo and Punga in particular run these quite often. And as we speak, I'm actually waiting for a Grebo Chaos Dwarf team to arrive, which I'm looking forward to. You can often get some really good deals on Kickstarters, so have a look out for those as well and see what's around. One last thing on miniatures, like there's a growing trend around 3D printing. Now, I personally, I'm not going to endorse or want to go near. I genuinely don't want anything to do with anything that's like a direct replication of any of these teams that Games Workshop makes. I don't really think that's on. But there's a lot of stuff out there that's like a really interesting take or uses sort of quite different ideas to represent teams. And you can get them as STL files, like you can buy them. So Punga are one of the bigger companies for this, and as far as I can tell, you can buy pretty much, like if not all, of their teams as just STL files to print yourself at home. Now, I don't have the equipment to do 3D printing or the space to do it. It's something, if I had the space, I might investigate. But if you've got that sort of setup, there's a really good episode of the Bonehead podcast where they talk about this. Like the guys who do that show are like really into their printing. And there's some really good pointers for places to look and good recommendations of where to get files from. So you've got the board out on the table, you've got 2 teams of miniatures and you've got your dice. Next, you and your opponent are going to need to draft a team. So let's go back to our human and undead teams again. I'll just pop them up here. And we talk about money. So the standard budget you get for a Blood Bowl team is 1,000,000 gold pieces, and that will buy you a team. It's just up to you how you spend that money, how you build your team. If you're playing an exhibition sort of one-off game, or even actually if you're starting a league, like you can agree with your opponent or the whole league a different starting budget. It's just a good idea for everyone to start with the same. But 1,000 is normal. 1,000 gold pieces. We tend to abbreviate everything to thousands in this game. So a human lineman, for reference, costs 50,000 GP, 50k. So we work with that sort of 50 number. And you can afford 20 of those with your 1,000,000 gold pieces. A Blood Bowl team can only have a maximum of 16 players, though, and a team made entirely of linos isn't going to be that good or fun to play. You do have to recruit at least 11 players when you draft a team, so you can't just sort of fill out your roster with expensive options and then leave yourself on like 7 or 8 players and top it up with journeymen, which we'll come to in a bit. There's loads of material out there for starting rosters for teams. And again, the Bonehead podcast has a whole series on this that covers every team with several recommendations for how you build a team at the start. And I'm going to link the playlist for that below, so you can browse to your team, have a look through them, see what you think. One thing I would suggest for any team, though, especially for a beginner, is to build your team to include at least 3 rerolls if you can. They can get you out of a bit of trouble, and skimping on them is just going to end up with you taking more turnovers than you need to, and can just be quite frustrating. Some teams, like the Elven teams in particular, really struggle to get 3 rerolls and a decent lineup at the beginning. There's only really one of the 4 that can do that. And that's one of the reasons I wouldn't normally recommend elves for beginners, because they can, because of their agility 2+, they can get away with a lower reroll count. But it's a risky way to play, I think, especially as you're learning the game. And it's just one of the things that I think makes them not especially beginner friendly. So I'd suggest for your team, stick 3 rerolls down and then recruit some players. And if you really wanted to get into some depth with the roster builds, see what Ben from Bonehead's already done in that link below. It's great material. I'm not going to be able to do it any better, and there's no point in me trying to replicate it. But just look out for the 3 reroll builds, because that's probably what a good solid place to start. A couple of other things to mention. So we talked about apothecaries in part 6. They're available from the start, but perhaps not often taken that early on because of the requirements to recruit at least 11 players and have a team first. So apothecaries usually will come later. Some other things that are available at the start, like you might have a bit of spare change left at the end, where you can't sort of spend those last 10 or 20,000. But yeah, other things that are available for 10k are assistant coaches, cheerleaders, and dedicated fans. Now, the first 2 of these, all they do is affect some events, like random events that happen at kickoffs, which we'll deal with shortly. And when we get to that kickoff table, we'll talk about what they do. Dedicated fans has an effect on how many of your fans turn up to a match to support your team, which we're also going to come to shortly. But they also give a boost to how much money a team earns after the match, which has no effect on one-off games, but it's more about ongoing leagues. So once you have teams, you calculate a value for them, which is your team value, and that's just a total of everything you've bought, the value of all your players, all your coaching staff, including rerolls, things like that, and it's just a total. So if one team has a lower team value, they get given some extra money to make up the difference, which they can spend for inducements. Inducements are just one-off perks that last just for this game. You don't get to keep any money they don't spend, it's just for this game. So if you don't spend your inducement money, you lose it. So there are quite a lot of options for this. We're just going to briefly go over the core ones and perhaps mention a couple of others in passing. The first 2, the cheapest ones, they're 20,000 each, and it's just the opportunity to hire extra cheerleaders or assistant coaches just for this game. And like I said, we're going to cover what they do when we look at the kickoff table. So they're just one-offs just for this game. You up your cheerleader or coach count. For 30k, you can get yourself a weather mage. So this is a new one, and it allows you 1 extra roll on the weather table, which we'll also look at shortly. At the beginning of any of your turns, for which you can modify the result by up to 2 in either direction. And the change to the weather lasts for all of your turn and then the opponent's next one. So it's just a temporary change to the weather. Then it goes back to how it was before. For 50k each, you can buy up to 2 Bloodwiser kegs. Now, each one of these gives you a +1 modifier to rolls for players to recover from knockouts. So it's that 4+ roll to recover at each kickoff for knocked out players. And you can improve that to a 3+ or a 2+ roll. And that lasts for the whole game. So up to 100k now. So the three main ones are a Wandering Apothecary. You can take up to 2 Wandering Apothecaries, and these are just extra apothecaries that you can hire for one game. They work exactly the same as the permanent ones that you can hire. And teams that don't get access to an apothecary still have the option of hiring a mortuary assistant or a plague doctor, depending on whether they're undead or Nurgle teams. And these both do the same thing. They just offer a single reroll on a regeneration roll. Extra team training is also 100k, and it's just an extra team reroll that you have just for this game. And then the final 100k one is bribes. So you can take up to 3 bribes, and they allow you a 2+ d6 roll to try and overturn a sending off. So this can be from a foul, in which case the player stays on the pitch, the turnover's avoided, you just imagine you never rolled a double in the first place. Or it's for something. You can also use bribes for something that we've not mentioned yet, which is there are some players who smuggle weapons onto the pitch. Also illegal in Blood Bowl. But these are just traits that some players have, so it's not something your players can learn to do. But a player with a secret weapon is just automatically sent off at the end of any drive in which they played. And in either case, though, if you roll a 1 with your bribe, you can try again with another bribe if you want, until you run out of them. But if the bribe ultimately fails, it just has no effect. The player's sent off. So almost there on inducements. Halfling Master Chef. These are expensive. They're 300k. But halfling teams get a discount, and they're 100k for halfling teams. And the halfling teams are usually the only teams that will take them. And these they can steal rerolls from your opponent and give them to you instead. That's what they do. Wizards, now there are a lot of wizards nowadays. Most of them are in an expansion, which we're going to mention shortly. But you can only hire 1 wizard of any kind, so you choose 1 wizard and that's the only one you can have. The core one in the rulebook is 150k, and it gives you a choice of 2 spells. One is a fireball that will hit a 9 square area on the pitch with a 50-50 chance to knock over each player who's underneath it. And then the other one, it targets a single player and it attempts to turn them into a frog. That used to be a lightning bolt which hit on a 2+. Now you get to turn them into a frog. I think you have to roll over their strength on a d6, I think is how that works. So it's not as reliable as it used to be with the lightning bolt. And finally, there are several star players and what are termed infamous coaching staff. And these all vary wildly in price. They do different things. The players will play in different ways and add something special to your team. You can have up to 2 of each of these. The coaching staff will just have some effect on the game. It's all in the description of the players, and the players have their stats. And now there's a supplement called Death Zone, which actually is right here, this book here, and it adds a lot more options for inducements to the game, as well as some other things. But most notably, so the new options for wizards, so a huge list of wizards at all sorts of different costs, because you only have 1 wizard of any kind. And there's something called mercenaries, and these are sort of basically a custom buildable star player. But while you get used to how to play Blood Bowl, ignore Death Zone for now. You don't need it to play the game. Just stick to the things from the core book. The Death Zone's quite fun. Maybe pick it up later on. So a few things to run through before actually kicking off. There's a pre-game sequence to run through on page 37 of the rulebook. And this is just what you do before you start a match. It's a little sequence to go through. And first up is fans. So each coach rolls a d3 and adds their dedicated fans value to their roll. A d3 can be rolled by just rolling a d6 and halving it. And this result is how many thousand fans turn up to watch each team. And both coaches should note down their numbers that they get. It's called their fan factor, and it might have an impact later on. Next is the weather. So this is a 2d6 roll on this table here. But traditionally, each coach rolls a d6, adds them together to get the result on this table. So if totals 4 to 10, weather doesn't have any effect on the game at all. The extreme numbers do. So 2 is sweltering heat, and this will remove the same number of players from each team at the end of each drive because they're just too exhausted to carry on. 3 is very sunny, and this makes it harder to throw the ball. 11 is pouring rain, which makes it harder to pick up or catch the ball. And 12 is a blizzard, which makes it impossible to throw the ball further than a short pass. So no long bombs, no long passes. And it also makes it more difficult to rush. So all the details for these, how they work, they're in the rulebook on page 37. But also, I'm pretty sure on the cheat sheets that come with the game. Next up, you take Journeyman. That's the next part of the sequence. And you only do this if your team numbers fewer than 11 players at this point. and then you add for free as many lineman players from your team as you need to get you back up to 11. And a lineman player is one of the 0 to 12 or 0 to 16 selections, so like human linemans, skeletons, zombies, it's that sort of player, and you get a free one. But these players all come with the Loner 4+ trait. Some you've not looked at yet, but the Loner simply means that if you want to use a team reroll for an action this player's performed, you have to succeed on a 4+ roll in the case of this Loner 4+. You have to succeed in that roll first, and if you fail, the reroll's wasted, the original result stands. Next is Inducements, which we have already discussed in that last bit, but this is the point after hiring Journeyman that you work out your relative team values and how much one team's going to have to spend on Inducements. So Journeyman do count towards team value. Both teams can also, as well as the petty cash given to the lower rated team, they can spend money from their treasury on anything that they'd like from that inducement list. And once both teams have finished with inducements, you recalculate your team's values and compare them. And if there's a difference of 50k or more between the teams, the lower ranked team then gets to roll on something called the Prayers to Nuffle table, which is another D16 roll. And Nuffle is, of course, the god of Blood Bowl, and you can read lots about Nuffle in the Blood Bowl rulebook. So the underdog gets one roll on this table for every full 50k difference in the teams. There's a variety of very minor game effects on this table. You can find the whole table on page 39. You basically see what you get, have a look, apply that effect to your match. Some of them mention something called SPPs, which we're going to look at in part 9 when we talk about player advancement. SPPs are basically experience points for Blood Bowl players. They're called star player points. Like I said, we'll get into how they're earned and used in the next part. They only come into effect in ongoing league situations, so don't worry about them for one-off games. And everything on the Predator Nuffles table is pretty self-explanatory. Now we're finally ready to kick off. So at the start of the game, you flip a coin or you roll off if you prefer, which is both coaches rolling a d6, highest winning. The winner chooses if they're going to kick or receive for the first half. The team that receives is going to have the ball to attack with and then takes the first turn. And they'll kick off at the beginning of the second half, so the other team takes the first turn then. Now, I've mentioned quite a few times in this series the word drive without ever properly defining it in the Blood Bowl context. So a drive is simply all the play that happens between two kickoffs. So it begins with a kickoff and it ends when either a touchdown is scored or the half ends. And the team that kicks has a defensive drive, the team that receives has an offensive or attacking drive. And there are some game effects that might last like for a drive, or you test to see if knocked out players come back at the end of a drive. So it's probably something I should have mentioned earlier than I have now, but that's all it is. It's all the play that happens between two kickoffs. So the team's set up for kickoff, and we looked at the requirements back in part 1 when we looked at the pitch, but the kicking team sets up first, and they can place 11 players on the pitch, and they have to put 11 players down if they can. So you can't hold reserves back if you've got 11 players available. There might be reasons to do that which are involved with secret weapons and getting sent off and stuff like that, but you won't need to worry about that if you're using one of the good starting teams. So here the humans are kicking to the undead, and the kicking team sets up first. So they have to place a minimum of 3 players on the line of scrimmage, and that's usually all that survives to sort of minimise the number of blocks that you're going to be on the receiving end of. They can also place up to 2 players in each wide zone, which is up to 4 on the wings in total, 2 on each side. Next, the receiving team sets up, and they have the same restrictions, at least 3 on the line of scrimmage and no more than 2 in each wide zone. They're probably going to put more players on the line of scrimmage so that they can make sure they're getting assists for 2 dice blocks, probably 3 dice blocks as well. And are probably going to want to consider that stage, like where their blitz is going to be in the first turn, also how they're going to secure the ball. They don't yet know where the ball is going to land though, because that's going to involve a scatter. So here the kicking team nominate a player to kick the ball, so maybe the thrower, and that player can't be on the line of scrimmage or in either wide zone. And then they choose a square on the kick to they choose a square on the pitch to aim the kick at. They're going to want it to keep the kick on the pitch. If it leaves the pitch or scatters back into their own half, the receiving team are awarded what's called a touchback, and that means that they can just give the ball to any player they want, and this avoids them having to make a potentially turnover causing pickup roll, but it also means they can maybe give the ball to a player that's going to be difficult to get the ball off of, and also with low agility who you wouldn't normally risk a pickup or a catch with, such as maybe a mummy. Like if you can get a mummy to score a touchdown, they can level a bit faster, and they're quite difficult to score with, being slow and not agile. But the player that you give the touchback to does have to be unmarked though, so a mummy's not going to work in this situation. Maybe you'd go for this white, or just give it to one of the ghouls. But to give you the best chance to keep the kick on the pitch, it's a good idea to aim right at the middle of the half, which is why I've got these sort of highlighted squares in the middle of each half of this pitch. This doesn't make it impossible for the ball to go out, but it does reduce the chances quite a lot. You then deviate the kick. So this is like with the wildly inaccurate throw. It's a D8 for direction and a D6 for distance. You'd need it to probably go the full 6 squares to go out. Let's just scatter this in real time. So this is a kickoff, I've called it on here. So it goes 6 squares in that direction. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's ended up being quite a shallow kick, which is quite good for the example. Then we pause the process to flag up. We'll just flag up a useful skill that comes into effect here, which is called kick. So when the player kicking has the kick skill, you have the option of halving the distance on the scatter, rounding down. So this you could have chosen to instead scatter this 3 squares if you wanted to, or if you rolled a 5, because you're rounding down, it would have gone 2 squares. And you get the choice if you do this. You can either go 3 squares or 6 squares. Kick's quite flexible like that. And what this allows you to do is to sort of push kicks more into the corners of the pitch, which some teams, sort of fast and agile ones in particular, can really use to their advantage. But once you scatter the ball though, you then roll a 2d6 on the random event kickoff table, which looks like this. And you can find this on page 41 of the rulebook. I'm going to run through these very quickly because this is an area that's had some big changes for the current edition, if you're familiar with it from before. So it's a 2d6 roll, and 2 is get the ref, so a double 1. And this is one of the ones that's unchanged actually. It's just a free bribe inducement for both teams. They get 1 each. Timeout is 3, and this is a renaming of the riot event from previous editions, but it either increases or decreases the current turn count. You can see the text for the details of it. 4 is a solid defence, and that's used to be called a perfect defence. It now allows only D3 plus 3 open players on the kicking team to reposition anywhere. So nobody who is marked by an opponent, as long as the team maintain a legal setup. Previously, this was just the whole team could redeploy, and it didn't matter if players were marked. You just pick a new setup that's legal, and that was it. So it's been a bit toned down, only between 4 and 6 players, and only ones who aren't marked, so the humans could redeploy some of these. But they might want to do something like go over here, because that's going to make getting the ball for the undead tricky. 5 is a high kick. That's any open player on the receiving team, so the undead gets a free move to where the ball's going to land and can attempt to catch the ball. It has to be a player who's unmarked, so it would be none of these ones on the line of scrimmage. But you can maybe just move a ghoul right over here and try and catch the ball straight away. This one's been unchanged for many years. That's a staple of the kickoff table. 6 is cheering fans. So this is where cheerleaders come in, those things you can hire on your team. Both teams roll a d6, add their cheerleaders. The winner gets a free roll on the prayers to Nuffle table that we looked at before. On a tie, nothing happens, but that has changed, that one. That used to just be an extra re-roll for the half. Prayers to Nuffle is new for the edition. 7 is brilliant coaching. So this is, in a way, it's quite similar. It uses the assistant coaches that you can hire. You both roll a d6, you add your assistant coaches. The winner gets an extra re-roll that they have to use before the end of the drive, and that is a slight adjustment. It used to be you had to use it by the end of the half, but now it's just for a drive. So if someone scores a touchdown, you haven't used that extra re-roll, you lose it. Changing weather, so this is an 8 now. It always used to be a result of a 7, but it switched places with brilliant coaching. And it's just another roll on the weather table with a slight difference. If you roll perfect conditions, the ball gets scattered 1 more square by a gust of wind before it lands, and that may contribute to a touchback. So where the ball's scattered to here, there's a 3 in 8 chance that the gust of wind is going to cause a touchback. Quick snap for 9. So this is that D3 plus 3 open players. So nobody's marked on the line of scrimmage here. But D3 plus 3 of them can move 1 square for free. That's slightly toned down from previous editions, where it used to be the whole team could move 1 square, and even if they were marked, so you could have moved these players on the line of scrimmage forwards and those start overlapping. But a quick step here, you might say maybe this skeleton and white just step 1 square sideways each. In case they can catch a bouncing ball, it will save you a roll in your turn that will cause a turnover. You might sort of nudge the Gauls forwards, maybe diagonally towards this ball, get them a bit involved in the game, and maybe take this space here with these players on the wing. Sort of thing you could do with a quick snap, depending on how high you roll. It's only 4 to 6 players. 10 is a blitz, so this is the best one you can roll as a kicking team, even though it has been toned down a bit. So a blitz, nowadays you can choose D3 plus 3 open players in your team to take an action with. One of them can use the throw teammate action, with the ogres marked, so they're not going to do that. There's also no halfling on the pitch. But one of the players you activate can blitz. So this is a big change to this that does tone it down, as well as limiting the number of players who can do it. Is it doesn't count as a team turn, so it gets a bit fiddly with, well, not really fiddly, just a bit pedantic. So because it's not a team turn, you can't use any team rerolls during the blitz. And you also can't use any skills that specify a reroll for an action in your turn. And the big one this impacts is the dodge skill. So another function of the dodge skill we actually haven't talked about yet, is it gives a reroll on the first failed dodge roll in your turn for the player that has it. But skills like this that specify in the rules that they allow you to reroll in your turn can't be used during a blitz. So the humans will get to move between 4 and 6 players. And in this case, they probably want to go, right, catcher, go stand under the ball, see if you can catch the kick. They're probably going to want to blitz this skeleton, so they'd move a lineman here, blitz with that blitzer, and try and just claim this space around the ball, hopefully with the catcher holding it. So blitzes can be really powerful and actually quite game-changing, because suddenly the undead think they're attacking, but if the catcher catches that ball, they're now defending. And that's a big turnaround for the game. But a blitz previously, it was just anybody who's unmarked can take that action. You can use rerolls, you can do basically whatever you like, and they can be a big game changer. And it's something that a attacking team does have to bear in mind. Like, if there's a blitz, how much is it going to hurt me? Can I defend against it? 11. So this is called Officious Ref, which is an entirely new event, and it replaces the much maligned Throw a Rock, which has now gone. Both coaches for this, they roll a d6 that add their fan factor to the score. So this is the number of fans that you rolled right back at the beginning of the pre-game sequence. The coach that rolls the lowest with this total randomly selects one of their players from those on the pitch, or both coaches do that if the roll is tied. Then if you roll, once you've randomised that player, you roll a d6 for them, and on a 2+, the referee knocks them over and they're stunned. And they're going to miss the first turn of the drive while they're stunned. So it's going to be one random player, potentially one on each team. If you roll a 1 for that player, though, they get sent off instead, which is worse. So, yeah, you do want that 2+ to keep them on the pitch, but they're going to be stunned and miss a turn because they come to blows with a referee. Now, that is definitely less harmful than Throw a Rock, where it's just a random player gets hit by a rock thrown from the crowd and they could just die outright from that. And I've had players do that. And yeah, Throw a Rock was horrible, and we're glad to see the back of it. 12, so this is a double 6, and that 2d6 roll is a pitch invasion. And this has had possibly a bit of a slight toning down too, but it also uses fan factor again. So it's a roll off, and it's d6 plus fan factor. The lowest roller randomly selects d3 of their players to place prone, and they're stunned, and they're going to miss the first turn of the drive. In the case of the tie, both teams randomly select D3 players, but it's the same D3 roll, so it's the same number of players on both teams. And this is toned down in that the number of players is going to be capped at 3. That's going to be the most that it affects. The last version of Pitch Invasion was an individual roll for every player on the pitch, so every player had a chance to be stunned. And it was usually a 6, but the way that Fan Factor used to work would modify that and make it easier for the more popular team to get a benefit from that. But that's the kickoff table. You roll that kickoff event and resolve it, and then the ball finally lands, so it'll land in that square. And if a player is in the square where the ball lands, they can try to catch it, which is like catching a bouncing ball. Agility roll with a -1 modifier. If it hits the floor, it bounces once, so we bounce it again. This is a bounce rather than a kickoff. It goes that way, ball bounces to there. kickoff is resolved. And the bounce could well have been the last thing that took the ball over into the human half of the pitch for a touchback. The undead could go give them the ball. But then we go. So the ball lands and we go. The receiving team moves their turn counter along one, which I've still got on turn one from an earlier video. And then they begin activating players, like we described back in turn one. Not in turn one, in part one. And that is pretty much everything you need to know to get playing. You've now got everything you need about activations, about what the actions do, what options you have in your turn, how some of the skills work. Yeah, you can go for it. It might be an idea to, at this point, just go away, play a game or two, get the hang of how it works. You're still going to need to reference a rulebook or a cheat sheet for things, especially to check on what modifiers apply to rolls or the exact effects of block dice, what some of the skills do. Don't worry about that. It will become familiar the more you play. What we've covered in these last 7 videos is hopefully going to be helpful for coming to understand it. I have got 3 more parts planned for this series though, which might be good to come back to later. If you're going to play your first games with the 2 second season box teams, so Black Orcs and Imperial Nobility, I'd watch at least some of part 8, because I'm going to look at the teams available for the game generally, some of their strengths and weaknesses, and I'm also going to look at those 2 teams in detail, so including how all of their skills work, because there are some that we haven't mentioned yet. Part 9 is going to be about levelling players, developing teams, how the whole SPP system works, and that's only relevant if you're keeping your team, playing through a league season with them. And finally, part 10 is going to be about improving at the game. So we focused very much on how to play so far, just in terms of understanding the rules. But that final one, is going to be a bit of an introduction to how to play the game well and some tips for improving. So thanks for watching through all of these, if you have so far. If you're new to the game and you've been watching this to get the hang of how it works, go have some fun, get the board out, sit down with your opponent and play through a game or two for exploring some of the other options, with the caveat that if you're using Nobility and Black Orc teams, watch the beginning of part 8 for a bit more on how those teams work.